Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a new commander from the Tarkir Dragonstorm Precons, Zurgo Stormrender. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my CCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel at no extra cost to you. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more for as little as $1. You can also become a channel member for just 99 cents. Show off your support with a logo next to your name and exclusive emojis. Or you can always just support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Zurgo is a 3/3 Orc Warrior with Mobilize 1 for 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. Mobilize is a new ability on Mardu-aligned creatures where they create as many tapped and attacking 1/1 Red Warrior creature tokens as their Mobilize value. However, these creatures get sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. That's not a problem for this version of Zurgo though, since he has a trigger that whenever creature tokens leave the battlefield. If they left while they were an attacker, you draw a card. If not, each opponent loses 1 life. This ability is super strong. Not only does it put opponents in the difficult position of blocking your attackers, which lets you draw cards, but if they don't, any tokens that die otherwise will ping the whole table for 1. One thing I do want to take advantage of with this introduction is to go over what it means to be attacking, so that way all the strategies in my deck are better understood. The combat phase has 5 steps: beginning of combat, declare attackers, declare blockers, damage, and then end of combat. When a creature is designated as an attacker, it's an attacker all the way until the end of combat. That means that after a creature deals combat damage, it's still an attacker right afterwards before the end of combat finishes. This allows us to make the most of Zurgo's trigger. For example, any tokens that die during the damage step of combat is kind of obvious. But for the uninitiated opponent, if they didn't block our tokens, we can still sacrifice them after they dealt damage in the combat damage step, but before the combat phase is over, while they're still attackers thanks to the end of combat step. In response to the end of combat step, we can sacrifice any tokens we can or want in order to draw cards with Zurgo's trigger. This is very important to keep in mind because mastery of timing is essential to making the most of this commander. Same with creature tokens dying outside of our turn. Sure, their deaths won't draw us cards, but any tokens that died while trump blocking will still trigger Zurgo and our opponents will all lose 1 life for each one. I know the intro to this video is pretty long, but that's because the deck is making the absolute most of these timings. And best of all, Zurgo himself makes at least 1 attacking token when he himself attacks. So the deck is running Access Tunnel and Rogue's Passage in order to make him, or any other attacker, unblockable. The tunnel will work so long as his power isn't pumped beyond his base 3, so keep that in mind. But soon enough you'll see why unblockability is good in the deck. All that being said, we don't have to worry too much about attacking with Zurgo, since the deck already has so many ways to create tokens. So first let's see how we're overwhelming the board before seeing how else we can make the most of those tokens. Keep in mind that having the best board means that we can also just win via beatdown if it came down to it. First off are Castle Ardenvale, Dalkovan Encampment, Den of the Bugbear, Dwarven Mine, Field of the Dead, Kirk Keep, Mirex, Springjack Pasture, Westville Abbey, and Fountainport, which do not take up slots in the deck for being mana producing lands. So I consider them auto-included here, even if some of them tap for colorless. Castle Ardenvale, Kirkkeep, Mirex, and Springjack Pasture are essentially just mana sinks to get incremental value if we have nothing else to play. That being said, the tokens created by Mirex do have Toxic 1, which might matter in longer games. In any case, these lands are here just to create tokens. Westville Abbey can also do the same, but it also has a built-in instant speed activated ability that lets us sacrifice 5 creatures. And you guessed it, that means we can sacrifice 5 tokens that are still designated as attackers. In any case, however we want to make the most of those 5 creatures dying, activating this land to do so transforms it into Ormendal Profane Prince. This demon is scary, especially in a hybrid combat-centric / Aristocrats deck like this one. A 9/7 flyer with lifelink and haste that can't be destroyed is pretty busted. Dalkovan Encampment and Den of the Bugbear are tied to combat, which is fine since that's the bread and butter of the deck. The encampment creates 2 attacking tokens that have built-in sacrifice clause at the end of the next turn. The Bugbear then becomes a creature that attacks, which carries the risk of going down a land if it dies in combat. However, with the way it's worded, you can stack its activated ability. So if you paid for it thrice, then you get to create 3 attacking goblins when it attacks. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Dwarven Mine creates the token only when it enters untapped, but that's fine because it's fetchable. Half of the deck's fetch lands can fetch for this once we have at least 3 other lands with the mountain subtype. It's not overtly strong, but getting a token for free in this deck is still a decent floor. Field of the Dead also has an enters trigger. This is the reason why even the lands in this deck are singleton. So not only are the non-basic lands singleton by default, but even the basics thanks to running only a single copy of each basic plus a single copy of each snow-covered basic. This means that once we have this in play, we don't have to worry about never having differently named lands because all the lands that enter after 7 will trigger this. Again, it might seem like a lot of work, but this is doing it for free without a deck doing nothing else besides playing lands when you have them. Hopefully your fetch lands can trigger it twice in quick succession when needed. Last but not least is Fountain Port. Just like the lands that are only here because they can be activated for creature tokens, this one also has an ability like that to create 1/1 fish. However, it can also create a treasure if we have nothing better to do to help us ramp further along. But more importantly, it can also be used to sacrifice a token to draw a card. So it's yet another instant speed way to sacrifice a token for value, all without taking up a slot on the deck. Similarly, to a certain extent, is Legion's Landing. The previous 10 token creators do not take up slots in the deck for being mana producing lands. However, I would not say the same for this enchantment, even if it only costs 1 white. It does create a 1/1 lifelink vampire token on entering, but more importantly, when its attack trigger resolves, it transforms into Adanto the First Fort, yet another land that can be activated in order to create creature tokens. In that sense, it becomes just like Castle Ardenvale, Kerr Keep, etc. Secure the Waste, White Sun Zenith, Decree of Justice, and Valor's Flagship possibly help us out better and faster than these lands, especially because they create X creature tokens at instant speed. Well, the last two do so if you cycle them, but that's even better since they can't be countered that way except by stifle type effects. In any case, these spells are amazing for filling our board at the beginning of the end step before ours, or even in response to a board wipe or an alpha strike coming our way. Grand Crescendo is another instant speed way of creating creature tokens. However, it also makes our creatures indestructible, so even if we paid 0 mana into the X, for just double white we can protect our board if it came down to it. This card is already good, but it's so much better in this deck. Isgard's Call, Defenders of Humanity, and Wildfire Awakener aren't as fast since they create X creature tokens at sorcery speed. That being said, they're still incredibly useful, especially Horn of Valhalla. You don't have to send it on an adventure, but after you do, you can cast it from exile in order to become a pretty epic equipment depending on our board state. Speaking of board states, Defenders of Humanity can help us rebuild it after a board wipe. Wildfire Awakener having Convoke is so busted here. We're essentially doubling our tokens at minimum, but we can tap non-token creatures too, as well as send actual mana to cast it, so this will only make our board even larger. Indulge can also make our board as big as what we already have. That's because after casting it, any attackers will somewhat have Mobilize 1. Only instead of creating attacking 1/1 red warriors that get sacrificed at end of turn, they create attacking 1/1 green white citizens. Then we can cast Excess from the graveyard to massively ramp us by creating as many treasures as creatures we control that dealt combat damage that turn. This card is so amazing here. Tilonali's Summoner, Anim Pakal Thousandth Moon, and Kaiser, Legion's Emperor, also create tokens depending on combat. The Summoner has the potential of creating us X tokens if we paid into it. Best of all, even if for some reason we don't get the City's Blessing, the tokens are exiled at the beginning of the next end step, which would still trigger Zurgo. So even if we lose them, it's still good. Anim Pakal doesn't need to attack, making the card even better than Tilonali's Summoner. The only downside is it doesn't get +1/+1 counters per non-gnome creature subtype attacking. I mean, it's still fine since it's incremental value and we're still creating attacking creature tokens. Kaiser is similar, but we need to sacrifice a creature. That's absolutely fine with this deck. When we do, we can create 2 1/1 attackers and then either draw a card for 1 life, or have Kaiser deal damage equal to the number of tokens we control to an opponent. All modes are amazing and all useful in this deck. Again, timing here is important. Since Kaiser triggers on attack, we can stack the triggers in such a way that we can sacrifice an attacking token. This will trigger Zurgo. Then, 2 attacking tokens are created before blockers are declared. Or we might not even need to create attackers. Maybe you want to draw another card and deal damage to an opponent's face. Kaiser is definitely one of the best cards in this deck for sure. Last but not least is Thalis, Reverent Medium. Oh wow, does she create a ton of creature tokens at the beginning of our end step. And not even our end step, but every end step. So if we created a ton of tokens at instant speed in some other turn, she'll create a ton of spirits at the end of that turn. Such an amazing card here. Combined with cards like Anointed Procession, Mandrak Glory Dominus, and Ohertak Deepest Foundation, and we can really overwhelm the board. These three are pretty straightforward, but special shout out to Mandrak for being yet another instant speed sacrifice outlet, all while also giving itself an indestructible counter, so it's almost impossible to get rid of. Same with Ohertak, since it transforms into a land when it dies. A land that's easy to transform back into Ohertak, since we just have to attack with at least 3 creatures before activating it during our post-combat main phase. Elspeth Stormslayer has a similar effect to these 3, since her static ability doubles our tokens created. If that wasn't all, her +1 ability creates a 1/1 soldier token, which will be doubled by her own ability. Her -0 ability puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, and it makes them fly until our next turn. Not until end of turn, but until our next turn. And her -3 ability destroys a big creature an opponent controls. This card is strong, not only because it doubles our tokens, creates tokens, and has interaction, but because it can pump our board too. Same with Ankle Shanker. This Mardu member doesn't create tokens, but it makes them very dangerous, along with every creature we control whenever it attacks. The best thing about the wording of this trigger is that even if we're creating attacking tokens on attack, if we stack our triggers accordingly, we'll get the tokens first, and then they'll get First Strike and Death Touch. So good. Since we're talking about boons, I want to mention Divine Visitation. It doesn't create tokens per se, but any creature tokens we create are instead replaced by 4/4 Flying Angels. This really helps with the beatdown aspect of the deck, especially when we're creating attackers or creating tokens at instant speed. And they have Vigilance too, so we can attack later and keep them up for blocks. Including cards like these also helps the deck have different avenues to victory. Speaking of different avenues to victory, Zurgo isn't the only way to pain opponents based on our tokens leaving the battlefield. The deck is also running Cruel Celebrant, Zulaport Cutthroat, Bastion of Remembrance, Venerated Stormsinger, Vindictive Vampire, and Funeral Room. These all drain the table whenever a creature we control dies. So not only are we hurting opponents but gaining life as well. This will set us up with a healthy life total to buffer attacks and for whatever other advantage we'd want. As a bonus, Venerated Stormsinger and Bastion of Remembrance also create creature tokens. As for Funeral Room, if we were to eventually unlock Awakening Hall, we can reanimate all of our creature cards in our graveyard. With this being an aggressive deck, this is definitely something to look forward to. This card is so amazing for this deck, it almost seems tailor-made for it. Ellis Ilkor Sadistic Pilgrim also pings the table whenever a creature we control dies. However, we don't simultaneously gain life from that. We gain life whenever a creature we control enters the battlefield. To be fair, that might be more often than not, so we can get some decent life gain from this. The Meathook Massacre has similar triggers, but it has the added upside of being an incredibly oppressive board wipe. So not only are we wiping the board, but it then stays in play to give us continuous value while it does. The deck has other board wipes, but this one is possibly the best one in it. Carter Doomscourge drains opponents for 1 life whenever an attacking creature dies. Keep in mind that this triggers on opponents' attackers dying too, not just our own. On top of that, it has a goading type trigger when it enters the battlefield, so this further increments the aggressive nature of the deck. Commissar Severina Rain has each opponent lose X life, where X is the number of other attacking creatures. Again, pay attention to the wording. X is not counted when creatures are considered attackers. This is super important because creatures that enter attacking do not trigger effects that do so when attackers are chosen. This means that if we had 5 creature tokens entering already attacking, Severina will still count them and our opponents will lose life equal to those creatures. Not only that, but she also has a sacrifice outlet that gains us life and draws us a card. How amazing is that here? Mishra claimed by Gix has similar wording. Whenever we attack, the trigger counts how many creatures are attacking when it resolves, not how many creatures were declared as attackers. So any creature tokens that enter tapped and attacking will still be counted by Mishra. As a bonus, we also gain that life, making it very difficult to kill us when combined with our other life gain and life drain effects. Unfortunately, I am excluding Phyrexian Dragon Engine from this deck because we want this Mishra to stay as is and not become melded, since he then loses the attack trigger that we care about. Last but not least are Agate Instigator, War Leader's Call, and Perforous God of the Forge. Yes, I know that there are a ton of triggers that occur whenever creatures enter the battlefield. However, I am only including these 3 because I wanted to include the death triggers instead of the enters triggers, because those triggers don't just bring pain but also gain us life. That being said, these are included because the first one has Offspring, meaning that for just 4 total mana we get the effect twice and we get a token, which is obviously synergistic in this deck. The enchantment also pumps our creatures, same with Perforos. Not only will this become an indestructible 6/5 when Devotion is met, but we can also sink mana into it to pump all of our creatures +1/+0 each time. As for how we can sacrifice creature tokens when it's most convenient to us, the deck has a few ways that are also useful. Spawning Pit is a free instant speed sacrifice outlet. It gets counters whenever we sacrifice a creature, and then we could pay 1 generic and remove 2 counters from it to get a 2/2 creature token. So this performs double duty, essentially providing a type of revolving door for tokens, especially if we controlled any token doubling effect. Ashnod's Altar giving us 2 colorless mana is amazing for sacrificing as many tokens as we want in order to then power an epic X token creating instant spell, or to just help cast any big spell we want. Fanatical Devotion and Martyr's Cause are super good here though, so don't sleep on these. The first one alone can always help Zurgo whenever he attacks. Since he always creates a creature token when attacking, if he were to ever die in combat, we can sacrifice that same token in order to regenerate him. However, it's also just amazing on its own, turning our sacrificed creatures for not just value but regeneration shields too. Martyr's Cause does something similar, but it prevents all damage dealt to a creature or player from any source. So we can sacrifice creatures to prevent damage dealt to Zurgo, or other creatures from blockers or even attackers if they were blocked. Or we could just use it to protect any other key creature from damage. Something I love doing with this enchantment is responding to my own Blasphemous Act. Once it's on the stack, I can sacrifice creatures in response and it won't matter if the amount of creatures dropped below 8. It's already on the stack after having only paid 1 red for it. So those sacrifice tokens can be used to prevent our key non-token creatures from taking damage from Blasphemous Act. So not only are we wiping our opponent's boards, but we're keeping our own too, as well as triggering our Aristocrat effects. Absolute madness. Again, notice how timing is everything with this deck. Skull Clamp isn't a sacrifice effect per se, but each 1 mana we sink into equipping it to a 1 toughness token will get us all the advantages of a creature dying, plus draws us 2 cards. So good. Speaking of, Weatherlight Completed, Dark Prophecy, and Erebos Bleak Hearted are also ways to take advantage of our creatures dying to draw cards. The vehicle needs a bit of setup first, but we'll get those counters on it in no time. The enchantment at Erebos loses us life, but we gain so much life in this deck that it's whatever. Erebos is also another instant speed outlet, albeit not for free. That being said, it can be used to deal with creatures, especially indestructible ones. And then when Devotion is bent, it's a 5/6 indestructible blocker. Liliana Dreadhorde General also has a triggered ability that draws us cards whenever a creature we control dies. Notice that I've chosen these 4 cards because their triggers don't discriminate against token creatures, which is super important in this deck. Not only that, but she can also create tokens for us. Have everyone sacrifice 2 creatures, including us, so it's a type of sacrifice outlet. Her ultimate is not the goal of running her, but if we can ever pull it off, it can do some work. Nora's Wellspring doesn't draw us cards per se, but we can dig super deep through our library with the scrying. We can then activate it to draw the best card we scryed deeply into. Once we have our engines going, this is essentially a tutor. Reliquary Tower, Thought Vessel, and Decanter of Endless Water are included due to how many cards this deck draws. Even though our commander already provides us card advantage, the rest of the card advantage pieces in the deck draws us so many cards that it's worth running these, especially since the tower doesn't take up a slot in the deck, and the other 2 are also mana rocks. The deck isn't green, so it makes do, especially with Soul Ring being the only other mana rock in the deck. But there are 6 basic lands as previously shown, so Wayfarer's Bauble, Navigation Orb, and Burnished Heart are obviously included. The deck is making mana with sacrificing tokens and creating treasure tokens while also running a total of 37 lands, so it runs just fine, and even then sacrificing the heart is synergistic in here. Besides the previously shown Blasphemous Act, the deck is obviously running more cards in its interaction suite. There is Anguish Unmaking, Chaos Warp, Generous Gift, Stroke of Midnight, and Utter End for single target removal, Guthrie Wright's History and Unexplained Absence for multiple single target removal, with Ruinous Ultimatum and Vanquish the Horde for the board wipes. The instants that can get rid of lands are especially important to help deal with Maze of Ith type lands, but are also because players love running things like Cabal Coffers, Rogue's Passage, etc. Those lands also need to go. Vanquish the Horde you just know will always only cost us a double white to cast. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. Apart from the previously mentioned ones, the deck's running all 3 Shock lands, all 3 Surveil lands, Savai Triome, Reflecting Pool, and Command Tower. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Zurgo Stormrender. The moment I saw this commander revealed, I knew I had to make an aggro/aristocrats deck with it. It was so hard to trim this down to just 100 cards before I started testing it. This deck is just so much fun to play if you like complicated actions because you have to be very careful with your timings to make the most of your board state. When you sacrifice creature tokens, along with which order you have your triggers resolved, how you attack, when you cast your spells, when you activate your effects, etc. all matter. But at least that's super fun to me. Oh, and you're also smashing face while also gaining a ton of life and having opponents also lose a ton of life outside of combat. Plus, as expected from my deck text, a bunch of niche and obscure cards that definitely turn heads are in here. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. So make sure you get your Tarkir Dragonstorm singles there. I also want to thank any channel members. Your membership is greatly appreciated. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Bandit Kirby, and happy brewing.